Diary of a Man in Despair. Friedrich Reck. March 1943.
The monster has been given the evil tidings of Stalingrad. Naturally, it is going to raise itself for one last blow. And so terror has been loosed among us, once more. Himmler, I met him just once, at a party marking the new year of 1934, after Claire and I had been whirled through the confusion to land among these rather questionable people. At this point, this individual of strongly middle-class antecedents and the appearance of a bailiff felt called upon to drag me off to a corner and ask me who Herr Arno Rechberg was. Since Herr Rechberg, an extremely wealthy man and a high-ranking Mason, played one of the key roles in the fall of von Seeckt and in bringing about the Conference of Locarno, and was, in addition, one of the figures behind the scenes at the Herren Club and in the cabinet of von Papen, and since I knew him only casually, I attempted to extricate myself from the situation by answering Himmler's question with another question. How did it happen, I asked, that the Fouché of the Third Reich had to turn for information about such a personage to poor me? He looked at me in surprise out of his short-sighted eyes. I believe that my dialectical parry was lost on him for the simple reason that he did not know who Fouché was. But, not wanting to appear ignorant, he let me alone. I was very glad to get rid of him. This air of the subaltern he had about him, and the ineffaceable stamp of the petit bourgeois, in combination with his absolute power to kill anyone, were precisely what made him so frightful. This must have been the way Fouquier Tinville looked, the rigid bureaucrat, minister in charge of the underworld. This is the man now slowly elbowing his way to the front. And this is how we live now, as people must have lived before Thermidor and the overthrow of Robespierre, underground and essentially illegally, open at any moment to denunciation and the executioner's axe. The summary courts, presided over by sadistic and bloodthirsty Nazi Jacobins, make quick work of sentencing people to death, and 5-minute trials suffice. Stamped on the verdict order are the words liquidate and expropriate, which means execution and seizure of all property. The victim is shoved out a back door, where the executioner already awaits him. In 15 minutes it is all over, trial, sentencing, everything. Next comes the towering guillotine, and in university dissecting rooms the cadavers of the decapitated are piling up so high that university officials have refused further shipments of these silent guests. Heads roll for a bagatelle, they roll for doubts about the outcome of a war which anyone with half an eye knew was lost long ago. They roll for holding back a pound note, and they roll especially fast because of aspersions cast on the great general, as though one could cast aspersions on Caesar sitting there atop the Obersalzberg, who last year in the presence of someone I know called himself the present-day Scipio Africanus, and who falls into a paroxysm of rage if someone dares to doubt his affinity with God. As Lord High Executioner, he has converted the punishment for causing ridicule of the Führer from the former 6-week jail sentence into death by beheading. And we now have, as I am informed by the Traunstein public prosecutor, 11 guillotines in Germany. Recently, when the one in Munich went out of order, the Stuttgart guillotine was borrowed to help out. But production has never been better. A Palatinate man was beheaded because he pleaded with his only son not to take unnecessary risks at the front. A 74-year-old bank director from Stuttgart was beheaded because he was overheard on a train talking to another old man about the fact that the war was going badly. Oh, and they have even cruelly cut off the head of one of the 2 whorehouse madams in the employ of her Christian Weber, that owner of 2 bordellos and bosom friend of the greatest general of all time, the whole crime of this worthy lady being that, probably at the behest of her employer, she had asked for foreign currency in payment for the fleshly pleasures offered, and also that she had withheld for herself a small percentage of each day's receipts. Estimates are that in Berlin alone there are 16 beheadings a week, while in Vienna, where hatred of the Prussians is now white-hot, the figure is 20 a week. The hangman has 2 jours fixes per week, on which he works on a mass-production basis. Since he receives a commission for each hanging, plus his regular salary from the government, he obviously has a stake in the enterprise. I can imagine a notice in the personals column of a newspaper, composed in the proper new German proportions of sentimentality in sadism, reading something like this.
Government official. Military man in well-paid, pension-covered position, tall, blonde, good appearance, nature lover with definite views on life, seeks correspondence with like-minded woman, also blonde, with view to marriage. Not less than 5 feet 2 inches and not over 25.
Gentleman prefers blondes. Non-Olet, these platinum blonde Ingrids, Wibks, Astrids, Gudruns, and Isoldas would never hold their noses at hubby's profession. After all, this is vital government work. You think I exaggerate the hangman's social acceptability? Let me cite the following case, an episode of recent occurrence in Vienna. The well-known actress, M., a lady who was a leading tragedienne during the heyday of the Berg Theatre and then became owner of a winemaking establishment, from time to time had to dinner an official whose black market connections were of use on occasion. One day, this official brought with him to dinner an acquaintance who was extremely taciturn, seemed almost to avoid human contact, would not look one in the eye, and when asked if he was a resident of Vienna, replied in North German dialect that he maintained no regular residence, but had business in Vienna rather often. Afterwards, when the man had left, the lady learned that her guest at table that evening had been the hangman, in person. On the same subject, while in Munich recently, I was a spectator at a summary court trial, and saw a 65-year-old doctor convicted for possession of foreign currency sentenced to a mere 8 years in prison, although he missed the guillotine by a hair. The courtroom, a low-ceilinged, ill-lit and musty-smelling place, on the smoke-streaked wall of which a photograph of the old regent, left hanging by some oversight, looked on as though through a window of another world, the defendant, a trembling and stuttering old man, and the denouncer and chief prosecution witness, a sleek, blonde floozy, Swiss, incidentally, who had been the old man's housekeeper, the assistant judges, 2 civil servants, and the chief judge, pinched-faced, resentment in every line, a beast, a piece of filth, a Nazi horror who had climbed out of a fathomless depth in Lower Bavaria somewhere. No, this man's name was not Fuchs, who sent the Scholls, brother and sister, to the guillotine a few days ago, and whom we will soon drag before our tribunal. This man was called Rossdorfer, and he was until yesterday a counsel at law in the town of Plattling. Now, this canaille was getting a chance to vent the accumulation of decades of hatred of the professors, and this unlucky old doctor denounced by this Swiss harlot was a made-to-order target. The trial itself couldn't have been faster. The blonde nearly burst with National Socialist loyalty as she reiterated her denunciation. The old man tried to stutter something in defense, but the Lord High Judge roared him down before he could get out 3 words. The 2 assistant judges, who recognized me and were ashamed, avoided my somewhat ironical glance and, to give the appearance of legality to what they were doing, asked a couple of questions meant to be objective. The old fellow sensed a change in the air, took courage in hand and began to speak, and was at once given the knockout blow by a frightful intermezzo. What happened was that our wise and just judge, previously composer of grammatically questionable briefs for knife-wielding peasants and tax-evading peddlers, suddenly roared out the word baloney, banged his files down on the table and, purple with rage, engulfed the old man in bellowing. And then he did something which must be unprecedented in jurisprudence. He leaped from his chair, ran over to the old man, and shaking his fist under his nose, roared, "Listen, you. If you keep on with this stuff, I'll punch you one in the snoot." At which the taking of evidence was concluded, and the accused was ready for sentencing. He was given 8 years, at his age very likely tantamount to a death sentence. I left, thinking of many things, of that English parliamentary tribunal whose awe and respect for the brilliance of the crown once worn by Charles Stuart, and for the suffering of a man about to die, was such that it sent him to the block with something like a guard of honor, of that much maligned French tribunal which granted the condemned Charlotte Corday her request for an artist to paint her portrait before she was hanged, because the murderess of Marat wished to leave an example and a warning to posterity. This happened exactly 150 years ago, almost to the day, and the world has not only gone to the dogs in the interim, but several degrees worse, it has gone to the likes of this fastidious gentleman, who takes evidence with the aid of his manly fist, and will give the defendant, if he does not confess, one in the snoot. I ponder all this as I move heavily about Munich, observing how badly wounded it was in the last air raid, this city which was once so gay and beautiful. And at just this moment, I learned for the first time of the martyrdom of the Shoals. I never saw these two young people. In my rural isolation, I got only bits and pieces of the whole story of what they were doing, but the significance of what I heard was such I could hardly believe it. The Shoals are the first in Germany to have had the courage to witness for the truth. The movement they left at their deaths will go on, and as is always the case with martyrdom, they have sown seeds which will raise important fruit in time to come. This young brother and sister went boldly about their work, almost as though they were defying death. Their betrayal came through a miserable university proctor, who was then so afraid of being beaten or otherwise punished, that he had to be taken into protective custody. They were sentenced to death by a second example of the Rossdorfer type. They died in all the radiance of their courage and readiness for sacrifice, and thereby attained the pinnacle in lives well lived. I have learned something of their background from the young people who were with them. These were children who stood apart from the rest, of good Swabian stock, living in quiet, almost cloistered isolation, but even then having about them that special aura which presages early death. Their bearing before the tribunal, that of the girl, especially, was inspiring. They flung their contempt of the court, the party, and that insane, would-be great man, Hitler, into the faces of their judges, and at the end, did something which carries the icy breath of the eternal about it for us who survive. For, with their last words, they repeated the warning once given by the condemned knights of the temple to their judges, that those who were persecuting them and those who stood behind them would, within a year be called to judgment before the throne of God. The curse pronounced by the Templars was realized to the extent that before a year was past both Pope Clemens V and King Philip IV of France were dead. It remains to be seen what will happen here in the course of the next year. But the Shoals departed from this life quietly, and gravely and with wonderful dignity gave their young blood. On their gravestones let these words be carved, and let this entire people, which has lived in deepest degradation these last 10 years, blush when it reads them. Cogi non potest quisquis mori sit, he who knows how to die can never be enslaved. We will all of us, someday, have to make a pilgrimage to their graves, and stand before them, ashamed. This is the story of these two children of our race, the latest, and God willing, the first Germans of a great rebirth of the spirit. But Herr Hitler is occupied elsewhere at the moment. Herr Hitler is concerned, now while our cathedrals and national monuments are being turned into dust, with the teaching of counterpoint and the rules of harmony. Herr Hitler is laying the foundations of National Socialist music. And recently, Herr Göring was seen entering a party he was giving for his cronies wearing a fur coat that reached to his ankles, girdled by a red Morocco belt studded with stolen diamonds, and with red Morocco boots on his feet. I am sure he looked grand, this field marshal who never commanded in battle. But there is a precedent here in history, that unlucky Roman, Caligula, also appeared before his gaping subjects in red Morocco boots, shortly before he became unmistakably insane.